It's a privilege to be with you this morning and to be able to spend a bit of the morning of the forum with you. And it makes so much sense to start these 2 days of exploring current open adoption practice by having a look at the history and a history of adoption in New South Wales to better understand how and why we've evolved and we've changed and what underpins our current practice. And that current practice has been happening, as Anne said. I started in 1987 working in the local adoption program, counselling birth parents, assessing adoptive parents, placing children for adoption. And at that time, openness was in the beginning stages of our practice. So that's over a quarter of a century. I can't believe I'm saying that, but I just did. Over a quarter of a century that we've actually been practicing more openly. And we'll have a look at that practice, certainly current practice, and you'll see the growing changes in the course of this presentation. But what it will also help us to look at and understand is why some of the myths around adoption and some of the attitudes around adoption still perpetuate, despite our practice being different. Why has adoption impacted us, and why does it permeate as strongly as it does? And I guess probably the reason is it's a very big word. Adoption. It is emotionally very loaded. There are lots of stories around adoption, and many of them stories of a very shameful time in our history. Apologies for past adoption practice as recent as 2013. Adoption is controversial. It's in the media. From US stars adopting in what appears to be a nanosecond to Deborah Lee Furness talking about the wait times for families here. It's current. Very recent legislative amendments back in 2014 talking about more quicker, faster adoption. Now that scared me, and I work in the area. And it's also a big word because there have been many adoptions in our community. Since adoption was first captured in legislation in New South Wales in the 1920s, there have been over 265,000 adoptions in Australia. The peak year was from 1971 to 1972, when in New South Wales alone there were 4,623 adoptions in the state. Think about that number. For every one of those babies, for every one of those adoptees, so 4,623, there was a mother. Already, over 9,000 lives were impacted by adoption in that year. And they had a father. Every child had a father, although males weren't recognised in our legislation until much later. And as the father of a child, an illegitimate child, you had really minimal rights. There was also an adoptive mother who loved that child and took on that child and guided in terms of how to raise that child by us as practitioners at that time. There was an adoptive father. And of course, it doesn't stop there. Families don't. There were grandparents, parents to those birth mothers, parents to those birth fathers, and the same on the adoptive family side. And often we know birth mothers and birth fathers going on to have more children, as did the adoptive parents. So just think about that number of 265,000. Those maths are enormous. Take it down to 4,600. Think about, in 1 year, the number of lives that have been impacted. It's a huge word. And I think before we go on to look at the history, it's important to acknowledge a few things. First of all, that I'm sure that most of the people in this room have been impacted in some way by adoption, and how this information that I'm about to present is received may in part be dependent upon what your experience of adoption was. If your experience is personal, you or someone close to you is a parent whose child was placed for adoption, or an adopted person, or an adoptive parent, parts of this might be difficult. For some of us, the experience of adoption is through our professional life, and the impact may resonate in a different way. It's very important to acknowledge that adoption can be a very sensitive and difficult subject, and we don't always know the stories of our colleagues, or the clients we are working with, or from what time in our adoption history they were affected. It's also really important to acknowledge that I will speak of mothers and not as much about fathers, because they weren't recognised in legislation and they were unknown and unheard, even through the adoption inquiry that was held in this century. I'll also talk about birth mothers for ease of confusion between birth mothers and adoptive mothers, or mothers and foster carers. So I'll say birth mothers, even though that's a term that doesn't sit well with a lot of women impacted by adoption. And it's important also to say that we are looking at past behaviour and judging it by the standards that we have today, with the benefit of hindsight. Our practice, our policies, our legislation are formed on the basis of what is or what isn't happening in our society at the time. And this has certainly been the case with adoption legislation and practice. Ready to go back? Modern adoption legislation was first introduced in the state of Massachusetts in 1851. New Zealand in 1881 as the first country in the British Empire to legalise adoption. New South Wales adoption legislation was first introduced in the 1923 Child Welfare Act. So it didn't get its own legislation. In fact, it didn't until 1965. And it was further mentioned in the 1939 Child Welfare Act. And England followed with adoption legislation in 1926. So why was adoption legislated? What was happening in the society in that time? Well, we'd had the First World War, 1914 to 1918. The Great Depression started in 1929. It was a time of great poverty and large numbers of homeless children. Infanticide, so newborn babies found dead. Baby farming, where private board and lodgings for babies or young children at commercial rates occurred, a practice that was often abused for financial gain, including serious cases of neglect and infanticide. So for homeless children, it was to be homeless or to be institutionalised. And there had already been an inquiry in the late 1800s about the abuse that occurred in institutions. Sound familiar? Adoption was an attempt to encourage couples to meet the needs of large numbers of homeless children. And initially, that legislation was opposed for a number of reasons. There was a school of thought that legitimisation of these children through adoption would be an incentive for women to act more irresponsibly and have more children. There were concerns about children being used for slave labour and immoral purposes. There were no guidelines around who could adopt these children. Adoption was initially very slow. There are numbers of fears associated with adopting children from a different background from oneself. Ideally, they would be of the same class to the adoptive parents. It was generally believed that bad blood could be passed on These children were as bad blood. The birth mothers from a middle-class background were led astray. If they were from working-class background, they'd simply fallen. Genetic checks were sometimes done on these children. They were kept sometimes in children's homes for 12 months to check their development before adoption. There was a concern about the perpetuation of moral and mental deficiencies. Yes, and it's the bad blood. It's interesting because I think, I'm working in inter-country adoption for a while in probably, early 2000. And that sense was still there in some of the countries that we were receiving children from. Korea, for example. Male babies were sent to Australia because they didn't want that name, the male name. The child carried the male name on, nor did they want that bad blood passed on within the generations of their family. Interesting, isn't it? Adoption was also seen as a charitable act, and children who were adopted were made to feel privileged and should be grateful. Notice then, there isn't secrecy at that time. In fact, it wasn't until 1967 that the name of the birth mother on the adoption order was to be removed. The other thing about that early sort of adoption legislation was that birth parents could come and claim the child prior to adoption legally occurring. So there was a fear for the adoptive parents around the lack of permanency. 40s, 50s, 60s, leaping ahead in history. Post-war, the return of soldiers, an increase in the number of ex-nuptial children. And should a mother fall outside the norm because of poverty, skin colour or single parenthood, our society saw her as unfit and her child as neglected. It was an era then in which institutionalisations, foster care and adoptive families were believed to benefit both the children and the community rather than to be raised with that unmarried mother. There was also a time of practice, and I've known women who've been affected by this, where a child was born and then cared for by their grandmother or aunt or a family friend, so adopted privately, and that adopted person grew up not knowing about that. Women had been employed in the war effort. And that employment, those opportunities, were then taken, of course, by the men that came home from war. So the role of women changed to focus on family. The importance of family in our community became high, of homemaking. And for those women who were therefore infertile, it was a great stigma. It's a greater focus on environment and behavioural aspects of family life and the raising of children. Freudian development, Anna and Sigmund Freud, their theories encouraged adoptions and argued for the early separation of mothers from babies. It came to be known as the clean break theory, or the blank slate. The newborn was a blank slate. So there became a rationale for secrecy in adoption. There was an argument also that the psychological and financial qualifications of a white, married couple with secure incomes were superior to those of single mothers and impoverished families. So placement early, away from those people, safeguarded the welfare of the child, placement away from those single mothers. Bowlby was influenced by Freud and who later became renowned for our attachment theories. And Bowlby had looked at the permanent damage to children because of lack of maternal care in institutions. So early placement and bonding to another person shortly after birth could lead to minimal effects. His other work also suggested that children did not necessarily carry the ill effects of their hereditary. So we were moving away from eugenics to the nature versus nurture theories. In fact, there was a quote from Bowlby. He provided this to the World Health Organization in 1952. The proper care of children deprived of a normal home life can now be seen to be not merely an act of common humanity, but to be essential for the mental and social welfare of our society. So the change was from a focus on the undesirable child, they could be redeemed in the right family, to their mothers. The unmarried women who had children, a living symbol of sin. Being pregnant, regardless of your background, was a fate worse than death. And as we look back, we move into an era of one of the darkest times in our adoption history in terms of the punishment and treatment of those birth mothers. The need to cover up the shame of a child's illegitimacy and the terrible stigma that it brought to the child. The bastard word was used in a very different context then. And it was about protecting the child and renewing their identity. Segregation from their mothers, attitudes towards these unmarried mothers as having nothing to offer their child was reinforced by our society. In an address in 1959 from a doctor at the Royal Hospital for Women in Melbourne, this was said: "The prospect for an unmarried girl or her family adequately caring for a child and giving it a normal environment and upbringing is so small that I believe for practical purposes it can be ignored. I believe in such cases the obstetrician should urge the child be adopted. The last thing the obstetrician might concern himself with is the law in regard to adoption." A medical journal written in 1973 by a very well-known doctor at the time. In New South Wales, most unmarried mothers are likely to be poor, undernourished and of low intelligence, if not actually retarded. There was a link in with a mentality advocating the right of all legitimate couples to have children. Adoption became a service for those couples. Our era of forced adoptions. 1965 saw the first Adoption Act that was implemented in 1967. And that meant that private adoptions were no longer legal. Previously, adoptions had occurred between solicitors, doctors, midwives, private arrangements. So adoptions now, post-1965 legislation, occurred through the department or agencies were created. Some of our agencies is Catholic Care, Anglicare, Salvation Army, were agencies set up. Seventh-day Adventist, Barnardos were practising for many years. Strict confidentiality. It did not facilitate contact or reunion. There was a change of birth certificate. The name of the birth mother was removed from the child's original birth certificate and replaced, as it is today, with the adoptive parent's name, giving the child the equal status of any other child born into that marriage, giving the child legitimacy. That new birth certificate after adoption was sealed and in births, deaths and marriages, and they would never know about each other. The clean break. Protecting the child from illegitimacy, protecting the mother from the shame, and the adoptive family, giving them the security and the ability to take the child home and make it their own. Everyone could just go away and get on with their lives, forgetting about where the child had come from. It was a rather neat solution for all the parties, seemed to be. When I first started practising in 1987, the 65 legislation still stood, which meant that there had to be 3 full days after the date of the birth prior to a birth mother being able to give consent. And then a birth mother would also have 30 days in which she could revoke her consent. And also that an adoption order was final. Unlike other orders in the family court or in the children's court, adoption orders don't get undone. There was also some criteria brought in around the assessment of adoptive parents, although I can remember doing assessments at that time, and there seemed to be a lot of focus and a lot of lines on the page for the house, and particularly whether it had a tiled roof or not. Never did quite understand that. A very flimsy sort of assessment process. Any of you watching this, love child? I haven't been, yeah. But it does give you a snapshot into the time. It was set in 1969. And also about culture at that time. Australia had not established itself as a multicultural society. There was not a developed awareness of the culture of Indigenous people. We were white, white, white. And those babies of multicultural backgrounds were much harder to place for adoption. But some of the adoption practices: misinformed, punitive, cruel. The Adoption Inquiry, the Legislative Council Standing Committee on Social Issues report, was called Releasing the Past, and it looked at adoption practices from the 1950 to 1998. It looked at the traumatising experiences of adoption practice in that time, particularly for birth mothers. And I'm sure you're aware of much of this. Their records are not consistent, and they're at different levels of extremes. It was interesting because the mothers themselves were institutionalised in unmarried mothers' homes, often abandoned by their own families, not having any choice in being sent away if you were unmarried and pregnant. It was such shame to the family, the secret of you had to be kept. The mothers sent away until they could place their baby for adoption and then go back home and everything would be normal. And it's interesting, that phenomena, because I remember in the 1970s I was at high school and working in a nursing home, Presbyterian nursing home, Pitchwood at Ashfield, and the pregnant girls were there. So I was a tray maid in the afternoons after school, and they were tray maids too. And they'd come from all different parts of New South Wales and Sydney, squirreled away, not having contact with family and certainly not with the baby's father, and were there until their pregnancy had ended, and the majority of them placed their babies for adoption. That was in mid-1970s. A lot of the women didn't have a choice, forced into adoption. If you love your child, you would give them to a two-parent family. There was minimal financial assistance available, and if you had no family support, how would you survive? There are reports on bullying behaviour by consent takers, mothers not being shown all of the form that they were going to sign, forgery of signatures, not being informed about what it meant to give consent to adoption, or how to revoke their consent if they change their mind within that 30 days. Not knowing that their baby had actually gone from the hospital, or even knowing about that baby again. Knowing nothing. Some of them didn't know whether their baby was dead or alive, weren't allowed to see their baby, had pillows put over their faces, didn't know whether it was a boy or a girl. It was seen to be better for them. Was it punitive? Some mothers would say so. They were being punished for being unmarried and pregnant. And there was also a school of thought that it was better for them. If they didn't see their babies, that it'd make it far too difficult to give them up for adoption. It might make it easier to give them up for adoption. We didn't know about or understand the trauma of separation for these women, and that it was something that wouldn't go away. Adoptive parents were told to go away and make their baby their own. In fact, what was thought to be excellent practice was for a woman who had given birth to a stillborn baby to be given a baby born at the same time available for adoption. It was a perfect match, really. She was ready to breastfeed, she could take the baby home. No recognition of that woman's need to grieve. They were told not to tell their babies, but some did, because it didn't feel right for many people. sometimes a doctored version of the truth, and I'm sure we've all heard those stories. I know a friend of mine was told that her birth mother had died. She was placed in her family at 15 months, so there could have been some sort of memory. She was told her mum had died. It was a great shock for her when on the reunion register she found her mother alive and well. Anxieties for a lot of adoptive parents about the child's birth family, and they were unable to test out those fears to understand where their child was from. And in turn, the secrets sort of perpetuated in terms of being able to talk to children about sort of who they were and why they were growing. And that grew more and more problematic as the children grew and weren't like them. And the kids had questions that often the neighbours had answers to. So that era of then a person not knowing they're adopted, but the whole street knowing, again, I'm sure there are lots of stories that you would know. Some adoptees talked about a sense of always feeling different, like they didn't fit. And then them finding out, sometimes after their parents, the only parents they'd ever known, had died, and stories of them going through papers and finding their adoption papers and then not having the only family they knew to process this with. The impact of finding out that all you thought your foundations were based on were not true. Not knowing who you are. It's hard to work that out when you don't know where you're from. And understanding the questions that resonate for people who talk about their adoption. Why was I given up? The stories where adoption was talked about in the family, you were chosen, and some adopted people have talked to me about there's always this great happy story about when I came into the family. I wasn't allowed to be sad because before I came into that family, I was given up by another. An underlying sense of rejection that permeated the lives of many of those adopted people. And a very strong sense of having the right to know the information about their origins. This was their story. They weren't that baby, they were an adult. The stories of women, at that time go on, about them being drugged when they signed consent, being discouraged from naming their babies. And I can remember practicing in 1987 and having to strongly, and how those things get embedded, in society. You don't even know why we do it anymore, but it happens. A story that I'm aware of in the family, they cooked, a bit of light relief for you here, they cooked their Christmas ham every year in a certain way, and they always cut off the end of the ham and moved it away and cooked it separately, prepared. And the daughter was saying, "Mum, why do we cut this off?" And the mother said, "Well, that's the way I was taught, because that's the way." I'll ask Nan. Rang Nan. "Well, why did you?" "Oh, well, my mother did it. Great-grandma was still alive." "Mum, why did you?" "Oh, I didn't have a pan that'd fit the leg of ham." Yet it became the tradition, the way it was done. And so have sort of a lot of these practices around secrecy and around adoption. I can remember encouraging women to give their baby a name. What it meant to a person getting their original birth certificate when records were later later opened and seeing unnamed male baby. Some were told they didn't have the right to do it. They needed to leave that up to the adoptive parents. Okay. But we were also seeing in that time in the 70s was a recession and opportunities for women to work. So we were seeing an increase in married women relinquishing children, increasing costs of childcare, difficult access to divorce. And society just kept changing. Another wave of feminism. Yes, we had our suffragettes, but we were back. Germaine Greer, Damned Whores and God's Police, Anne Summers. Contraception being more readily available. Legalised and safe abortions. Supporting mothers' benefit in 1973. Thank you, Mr. Whitlam. Free love. The hippie era. and information about the effect of secrecy. People started to speak about the anguish. As a society, we started to learn about grief and loss, that they don't go away, the not knowing the effect of that. And support groups began to form. And how did we change? Remember I said earlier on in 1972, the peak year in New South Wales, there were 4,564 adoptions. Well, in 1984, there were 741. We're still practicing under the same legislation, although there had been on over 20 occasions between 1965 and 1989, in response to our changing attitudes and societal expectations. There had been over 20 amendments to that 65 legislation. One of them being the establishment by the Department of the Voluntary Persons Contact Register to facilitate reunions. So you could place your name on a register as a person over 18, and if your birth mother or birth father or birth mother usually place their name there, then a match. Very controversial. There was also an adoption crisis. There were fewer newborn healthy babies available for adoption, so a big overhaul was needed. With the 1990 Adoption Information Act, focused on secrecy, but in unlocking it. For non-identifying information to be available prior to the adopted child turning 18, and identifying information afterwards. This legislation was made retrospective. So from a couple of generations of people being told to go away, not tell the child, not tell anybody, to post-18, the birth parent can come and find the child, or the child can go looking for the birth mother. Another thing that was brought into place was contact vetoes. So you could place a veto not on a person accessing the information, but on them using that information to contact you. It was a busy time. People were encouraged with their contact veto to leave a letter and some explanation as to why they didn't want the contact happening. Reasons usually from mums about them having moved on, married and had other children, and their current partner not knowing. There are a huge number of information requests and the need for post-adoption support services. The releasing the past report and the Adoption Information Act then led to a series in the 1990s of inquiries and reforms that led to the basis of our current legislation, the Adoption Act 2000. Research from overseas about the impact of closed adoptions. Stories from women and from adoptees about what it was like to grow up not having that information. From adoptive parents about their feeling that they couldn't raise their children based on what were lies. So we had our legislation introduced in 2000, and since that time a number of amendments, including in 2010 the same-sex adoption amendment, so a same-sex couple could also adopt, and our reforms as recently as October 2014. And before we look at this, I want to ask you again, what's your experience of adoption? And how might it impact you as a professional? Considering adoption for a child in your agency's care, working with birth parents, working with prospective adoptive parents, working with colleagues. I think as professionals we all need to ask ourselves and be aware of our own stories, our own attitudes, some of which from the past still resonate. I hear it all the time. A great fear of adoption as well. And after hearing that, wouldn't you be? as I started in this presentation to say that adoption practice has been more open, though not in legislation till 1990, but in practice for much longer than that. Often we start practicing, that's the changes in practice because of the changes in society and expectations that lead to the legislative change. But what we see also is the fact that legislative change, cultural change takes a lot of time. And I see that in our practice today. Some of our birth parents today are hearing and stuck in stories and ideas of adoption past. There's a lot of misinformation about current adoption practice.